Okay, let's go ahead here. So our next question is cooperation with evil. If you signed up for, you probably didn't sign up for a lecture in medieval moral theology, but I think it's important as we assess some of these other questions. First of all, to get a proper understanding of a better understanding of how we are likely to be approaching these issues. I think it's kind of affirming. We see, I think as Christians, a lot of ethical language thrown around that might confuse us or doesn't sort of sit right with us, and we're looking for a better language. And I hope the prior slides at least helped lead us in that direction. And I think they're also a necessary background for what we're going to discuss next with this cooperation with evil, which goes to a very very importantly to the question of fetal tissue research, and has been raised in the context of the vaccine issue. So, why is fetal tissue research controversial? Well, because it relies on a continued policy and practice of legal and widely available elective abortion. So the question is, to what extent are those engaged in fetal research cooperators in abortion? To what extent do those who benefit from such research cooperate? Are there relevant analogies to other examples of mixture between our own actions and those of others who are engaged in intrinsically evil acts? What are the best approaches to answering this question? So who is a cooperator? A cooperator is distinct from the principal agent of a morally objectionable activity. The current Archbishop of Sydney, Australia, a Dominican theologian by the name of Anthony Fisher, offers this definition. Through cooperating in a project, the agent in question, that is a cooperator, is not the one most directly involved, conceiving, instigating, directing, engineering the operation. Rather, she is in a secondary or subordinate role to the principal agent and contributes something which facilitates the wrongdoing. What she wants to know is how close she can probably get to taking part without becoming, as it were, an accessory, a conspirator. How involved can she be without becoming tainted by it? Okay, so that's one way of looking at the question, and I think a pretty fair and accurate assessment of how this is raised in the contemporary world, today's world. You may have heard in discussions of this topic about formal and material cooperation. So I'm cheekily saying that it's not just for Roman Catholics anymore. The formal structures and language of cooperation analysis are strongly connected with the moral theology of the Roman Catholic Church. There's no way to get around that. It's not a dogmatic or, Catholics are better at doing this. It just so happens that the language, to a large extent, has been developed over the centuries in the Roman Catholic world. The Catechism of the Catholic Church that reminds us that while sin is a personal act, we also have responsibility for the sins of others when we cooperate them, whether by direct or voluntary participation, direction, or, very importantly, endorsement, failure to disclose evil, or protecting evildoers. These are common ethical principles. They're not not a matter of just Catholic doctrine. They're not limited to Christians. And in fact, if you look back to the Catechism's definition, you can see that in civil law and secular law, these principles are enforced. Failure to disclose evil, cooperation with evil. We talk about accessories after the fact. That can be a criminal offense. We talk about conspiracies. Well, the conspiracy is an agreement to do an act that's unlawful. That could be an example of cooperation, even if you're not the primary actor. If you provide material assistance in certain cases, that's going to be enjoined by the criminal law. Furthermore, Christians find themselves under increasing pressure in the contemporary world to cooperate in activity that they consider to be immoral, and they need guidance on whether when such cooperation or such activity is illicit and when it's permissible, because not all forms of cooperation are illicit. So where do we get this language? Well, this fine-looking gentleman is St. Alphonsus Liguori. He was, as we can see, an 18th century figure. He did not invent the tradition of cooperation, but he gave it its fullest form. And he is considered a doctor of the church in the Roman Catholic pantheon, still recognized as a foundational figure in Catholic moral theology. So while notions of sinful cooperation, no stranger to Augustine, Aquinas, or for that matter, Aristotle, the current language that is often used was more fully developed by Liguori. Now, what's interesting about him is that he was a polyglot. He founded an order, the Redemptorists, which became a major order in the Roman Catholic Church. He was a painter, he was a composer, a poet. One thing he was not was a formally trained philosopher or theologian. His main concern in the volatile times of when he lived was pastoral and political. He lived in Italy. Italy then as now, a bit of a political snakebit, but more so then. Regional rivalries. There was still the Papal States. The Pope actually governed a large swath of central Italy, the various kingdoms. Italy wasn't united until 100 years after his death. And so he was dealing with that. In order to found the Redemptorist order, he had to run through all sorts of political slalom gates. So that's the basis. Now, was he not an intelligent person? Does that mean his moral theology wasn't well developed? No. It's just that it probably lacked some conceptual bases that we'll get to in a moment that should be subject to some refinement. He also wrote in the area of the manuals. Now recall we talked about the move to legalism and moral theology that we're looking at. We're moved away from a unified version of faith and ethics to one where ethics was its own realm and legalism, law, and obligation became the basis, more of a basis for moral theology. And when we say his objective was pastoral, well, one of the concerns in the Roman Catholic Church was guiding people who came for penance, and this is obviously not unknown in any Christian tradition, whether the sacrament of penance exists in that tradition or not, that we go to our religious counselors for guidance on what is a moral or immoral action. And one of the questions is going to be, well, I'm touching in some way or I might touch in some way in my human actions something that is immoral. So is there is that touching? Is that association of my action with something that's immoral? Is that licit or illicit? How do we decide that? Well, here's one view. Eminent moral theologian Tommaso Sanchez died about a century before Alphonsus was born. He set forth the view to furnish another with material which is itself indifferent, but without willing the sin, but for another motive is not to cooperate directly with evil. Right, so that was a bit laxist and led to some confusion, but it was a fairly common view. Alphonsus tightened up things a little bit, and here's a classic distinction that he drew between formal and material cooperation. Responding to Sanchez's and other more laxist views, he says, it is better to say that cooperation is formal, which contributes to, and I've put the Latin in there because it's important, we're going to come back to it, concurrit ad. Those who know some Latin know that means runs up to, which contributes to is fine, but the literal Latin would be runs up to the bad will of the other and cannot be without sin. but that cooperation is material, which contributes only to the bad action of the other besides the intention of the cooperator. Now, he did not say that material cooperation is not sinful. What he said is that formal cooperation cannot be without sin. It's always sinful. But whether cooperation, material cooperation is sinful depends on other questions. Now, probably the finest contemporary expositor of this tradition was a Jesuit named Kevin Flannery. He taught at the Gregorianum in Rome for many years. He's currently in emeritus status. Published a book on cooperation with evil in 2019. Anybody who's interested in the tradition should read this book. I don't know if I'm still on camera, but there's the book, and is as one person reviewing the book said, everybody else working the field should stop their work and read Flannery's book and start retooling what they're doing. What he says is that formal cooperation becomes an integral part of the evil act. In material cooperation, there is an intelligible barrier. In other words, there's some barrier between the act of cooperation and the intention of the act cooperated in. Okay. Now, the problem with Alphonsus's approach, and it's not his fault entirely, is that like any like almost anything you can reduce, any philosophical thing, you can reduce it, try to reduce it to its essence, and you can make some mistakes along the way. So here's an example. This is a chart from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Puts a very helpful chart. I don't know if it's intended for confessors or for people, but we can see how we get a decision tree here. So as a cooperator, one who assists the evildoer in some way. So on the left side, we have the formal. You intend the immoral act to occur, so you're equally guilty of the immoral act. Material does not intend the immoral act to occur, may be guilty of the immoral act. And then material is broken down into immediate. You're providing material that's necessary, to mediate, providing material that's not necessary, and then all of these categories, except remote mediate cooperation, are share in the guilt of the immoral act. Remote mediate cooperation does not share in the guilt when there is a proportionally serious reason to engage in the act. We're going to go to another example of a chart here. This is from Catholic Health Association. Now, the Catholic Health Association's chart here under formal does adds a very important category, and it's a very important category for our purposes, and that is implicit formal cooperation. The cooperating actor on the explicit side intends, desires, or approves of the principal actor's activity or wrongdoing. In implicit formal cooperation, the cooperating actor claims not to intend, desire, or approve of the principal actor's wrongdoing, but no other explanation for what the cooperating actor does makes any sense. We'll return to that concept in a moment regarding intention. It's very important, but and then over on the material side, we see distinction between immediate and mediate, and on the immediate side says usually more illicit. One thing that's very important to keep in mind, particularly when we talk about material cooperation, is the imputation of guilt. I mean, the ultimate judgment of our guilt, we know, does not lie in our hands. We know whose hands it lies in. But in terms of assessing what is, likely to be the case in the divine economy, divine judgment, we may consider that because of circumstances, that guilt might be lighter, culpability might be lighter than it is in other circumstances. So What are some cases of cooperation? One of the classic cases in the 16th century was the servant and the master being one who's engaged in acts of adultery, and whether, for example, a servant who, at his master's direction, writes amorous letters or copies amorous letters that are sent to a lover, or holds a ladder so that the master can climb into the window of his inamorata, have engaged in formal cooperation. And so that was a classic case. A locksmith being forced to help robbers break into a safe. More contemporary, a taxi driver taking a customer to the known address of a brothel, cooperating in evil. Here's three that are more relevant to our circumstances. A medical student who takes part in abortion to qualify for an MD. Does he share in the intention? What's his intention? His intention is to qualify for his degree. If he doesn't take part in the abortion in some way, then he's not going to qualify. He won't become a doctor. So his intention is not to perform the abortion or cooperate in it, but to qualify for MD. Does that exonerate him? A senior doctor who performs abortions does so with the intent of upholding women's rights. A junior doctor employed by this physician in some role is participating in the abortion, maybe to get a little bit graphic, holding the scalpel or whatever, but his intention is to keep my job. Is he engaged in formal cooperation? Is he engaged in material cooperation? Is he engaged in cooperation at all because of what he says his intent is? A nurse providing post-abortion care doesn't intend to take part in the abortion. What is her, is she a cooperator, and at what level of cooperation? I also put in the example of the county clerk asked to register a same-sex marriage, which was a few years ago was a bit of a public controversy. So how do we draw the distinction here? The typical distinction, as we saw in the charts, respectively from Philadelphia and from the Catholic Health Association, rests on intention. Since formal cooperation is only wrong, and only some forms of material cooperation are always wrong, that the distinction between the two is very critical. Kathleen Caven, who's written extensively on this topic and who will visit again in a few moments, repeats this shorthand description. Kevin Flannery, we talked about a moment ago, that this gets Alphonsus wrong. He actually said that formal cooperation is that which contributes to the bad will of the other, and material cooperation refers to the bad action besides the intention of the cooperator. So he's not saying that not saying in as categorical a way that it's the intention of the cooperator. He says, remember that phrase, concurrent ad. He says that the action runs into the bad will, contributes to, runs into the bad will of the other. And what determines our human actions? What determines our human actions ultimately is our will. Now, the distinction between will and intention and how they relate is, we could spend an entire semester on that. We're not going to get into that, but there is a distinction. Here's the example. Here's an example that will illustrate why Kevin Flannery is making this point. Remember the case of the junior doctor. We had it on the previous slide. The senior doctor's intention is to uphold women's rights. The junior doctor's intention is to keep my job. That's what he's telling himself. That's what's in his mind. But Flannery says the junior doctor cooperates in the will of the senior doctor to perform the abortion, even if his intention differs. Even if his intention is to keep his job, he has cooperated in the will of the senior MD to perform the abortion. You see that distinction? Now, who's a figure who talked very eloquently and at length? This is Elizabeth Anscombe. Some of you may be familiar with her. She's famous, among other things, not only for her writings, but for taking a very principled stance in the 1950s in opposition to Oxford, where she taught, granting an honorary degree to Harry Truman on grounds that Harry Truman had engaged in a horrendously evil act by authorizing the obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, without getting into that, the ethics of that particular question, it's a hotly debated issue. She did take that very principled stance, was very famous for doing so. So now, here's some of the things that she has said about intention. Remember, you go back to the servant and the criminus master. It was very commonly held in the 17th century, this is before Alphonsus Liguori came along, that it was permissible for the servant to hold his ladder as long as the servant's intention was to avoid the sack. In other words, to not be fired. That was his intention. Pope Innocent the 11th, I think around the 1660s, 1670s, condemned this proposition. And Anscombe says that that proposition, the erroneous one, holding up here, I think I can, let's see, I can annotate. Hold on a second, sorry. I believe I can annotate here. So that's the dubious proposition up here, that it was permissible. Anscombe defines this as Cartesian, that intention is merely an interior act of the mind that can be produced at will. Okay, I'm not very good at drawing, but there you go. Rather, the best way to discern one's intentions is to look at what one does. Okay, we can go back to Aquinas. Remember, he said that we can tell what a person is like by what he or she loves. Well, this is what one does. The idea, and there's a great quote, the idea that one can determine one's intentions by making a little speech to oneself is obvious bosh, and intention is never a performance in the mind. So intention is relevant, but the key driver of human action is the will, the efficient cause. Intention, go back to the Aristotelian categories, is the formal cause, but the efficient cause of human action is the will. Okay, so we're going to go down here to our, let's see, I think I've lost my, okay. For some reason, things aren't moving. I'm sorry about that. I've lost my cursor somehow.
So go back up to where you selected being able to annotate, and I think you can turn your annotations off.
Okay, there we go. Okay, now we're good. Thank you very much, Heather. Okay. Well, there we go. We still have them, but that's, we're going to get them on every one for some reason, but that's okay. I don't care. So what would Aquinas have to say about cooperation? Go back to him. Well, he didn't write about cooperation particularly. In the Summa Theologiae, his crowning work, what we call the Prima Secundae, or the first part of the second part of the Summa, he wrote what is called the Treatise on Human Action. 21 questions divided into all sorts of questions about intention and will and human action, and the where human action comes from and how we judge whether human actions are evil or good. You can buy that if you Google Aquinas Treatise on Human Action. You don't want to read the whole Summa or buy the whole Summa, you can read that, and it's a very interesting read. But Flannery considers this an advantage, and here's how he describes it. Although the formal material distinction serves some purpose as an approximate way of indicating what is morally acceptable and what is not, the more sustainable theoretically is the Thomistic approach, which obsesses neither about intention nor about indifferent human acts. Now, to break off the quote here for a moment, the question of indifferent human acts comes up. Thomas at base thought that in concept there are such things. In general, as a general descriptor, there are human acts that can be described as indifferent. But when it comes down to particulars, a particular human act done by Ed Grant or by Heather Zeiger or by David Prentice or by any of you, there are no indifferent human acts other than the let's say you're just walking along in a field and you absentmindedly pick up a piece of straw. Okay, that would be an indifferent human act. You didn't even intend it. You just sort of did it. There's probably other things, scratching your ear. You don't even know what you're doing, right? But otherwise, there are no indifferent human acts in the particular realm of human action. Okay. Uh, Thomas clearly regards intention as an important factor in the analysis of human acts, but not in any sense that excludes the possible importance or even the predominance of other factors in human acts. A human action might be recognized as immoral, and here's a very important quote for our purposes, simply by virtue of the fact, the circumstance, that it is closely related to the evil act of another. Okay. Now, here's a different approach. You mentioned Kathleen Caveney earlier. She concluded in a very important essay written in around 1990 that the classic approach of cooperation is inadequate to address some contemporary issues on the morality of human action. And she included in that specifically fetal tissue research. She concluded that some of these actions are ones of appropriation, how we benefit without contributing in either a formal or a material manner from the evil acts of another. Cooperation analysis does not cover cases where a person wonders whether they can take advantage. In other words, not whether they can engage in an action that might touch upon the evil acts of another, but whether they can take advantage of the fruits or byproducts of someone else's wrongful acts, which may be in the past, maybe well in the past. In such cases, the wrongdoer, the principal wrongdoer, is actually the auxiliary, and the person deciding whether to take advantage is the principal. So it's flipped. Remember, in classic cooperation analysis, the principal is the one who's doing who's actually doing the wrongful act, and the potential cooperator who's questioning whether the cooperation is illicit is the auxiliary. Here it's flipped. We who might take advantage of the wrongful act are the principal. The person who did it before is the auxiliary. Here are some examples that she gave. Fetal tissue research, obviously vaccine development. One example she gives is buying a dress knowing it was made by exploited labor. One example I give is lithium-ion batteries. We're moving into the battery world, cars and all sorts of things. Well, if you do any research into where these base minerals come from and how they're mined, not exactly ethically sourced. I won't go into the details, but they're widely available on the interweb. Accepting a promotion, she gives an example. A colleague has been unjustly demoted or fired, and in that person's place, you accept a promotion. Is that unjust? Have you appropriated evil in that case? One example she gives is accepting financial support of a spouse engaged in immoral employment. Here's an example ripped right out of the headlines today. The legacies of slavery or dispossession of Native Americans. Are those cases are any of these, all of these, some of these cases of improper appropriation of evil? Caveney also says that these are not at odds. Cooperation analysis fits for certain situations. Appropriation analysis works for others. Going back to virtue ethics, she says that we strive to avoid benefiting from the evil acts of another in order to inculcate virtue and avoid becoming inured to vice. So this is where virtue ethics goes back to properly to the Thomistic understanding that our actions in sort of a collective historical sense are either going to inculcate further virtue. Obviously the source is grace for virtue and the gifts of the Holy Spirit and all that, but our actions in cooperation with grace can inculcate virtue in our lives, or our vicious actions can result in us becoming inured to vice and therefore more prone to further vicious actions. It also, there's in contemporary moral philosophy and theology, there's a recognition of social structures of sin. This is not really a controversial point. It's Orthodox theology and the challenge of a Christian navigating an imperfect world. The problem with appropriation theory is, does it give us sufficiently precise tools of analysis? And when you go back to these potential cases of appropriation that have been identified, some of this can you can get into some rather subjective and difficult questions. Do we have sufficiently precise tools of analysis? Also, while the appropriation analysis has been accepted by a lot of commentators and writers, it seems, at least in the Catholic world, in the formal sense of the Roman magisterium speaking, it hasn't been explicitly adopted in its most recent statement on the licity of vaccines. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, the highest doctrinal authority in the church, speaks of passive material cooperation and that's probably that concept probably covers a lot of the questions of appropriation identified by Caveney. Now, Kevin Flannery, going back to him, so we have the formal material distinction, the Ligurian, what I would call the Ligurian tradition as it's been applied through the years. We have the appropriation theory. What's Aquinas' theory? As we said, does not exaggerate the role of intention. It's an Aristotelian pattern in stunning human acts, which opens up for some to the light of Christ. All factors are related to a larger concern. What's the larger concern? Are our actions consistent with justice and reason? As I said, there's no such thing as purely indifferent human acts taken in their particulars. Aquinas, in his treatise on human action, focuses, as Aristotle does, on the circumstances, the who, the what, the how, the why, with whom. They provide the context for connecting individual acts to justice or disconnecting them from justice, in other words, leading to injustice. This results in an analysis that's less formulaic than cooperation analysis, less subjective than appropriation analysis, and goes to a close examination of the circumstances of particular human actions. I think we are now at a point for a 10-minute break. I